Hello everyone, my name is Spencer Allingham and I'm the Regional Vice President at Condusiv Technologies for Europe, the Middle East and Africa. And today I'd like to introduce you to the V-locity software that you can use to speed up your SQL servers without having to reboot machines and without any SQL code changes being necessary. If you have any questions as I'm going through, you're very welcome to put them in the Q&A box, and I'll do my very best to answer all of them in a Q&A session at the end. So to illustrate why you might want to consider downloading and installing the V-locity software onto your SQL servers, I ran some lab tests using HammerDB to generate an online transaction processing type workload with and without V-locity installed. Firstly using SSD storage and then using spinning disk storage. As you can see from the metrics recorded by HammerDB, on SSD storage there was about a 30% improvement in the number of SQL transactions that could be processed per minute. And this was backed up by the Perfmon metrics that showed a 28% improvement in transactions per second. When running the tests again using spinning hard drive storage, there was around 100% improvement. Either way, this is great news for SQL DBAs who care about the performance of the databases underpinning their business-critical applications. Whether running SQL in a physical or virtualized environment, most SQL DBAs would welcome faster storage at a reasonable price. Condusiv's V-locity software is designed to provide exactly that, but using the storage hardware that you already own. It doesn't matter if you have direct attached disks, if you're running a tiered SAN, have a tray of SSD storage, or are fortunate enough to have an all-flash array. That storage layer can be a limiting factor to your SQL database's productivity. The V-locity software reduces the amount of storage I/O traffic that has to go out and be processed by the disk storage layer, and streamlines or optimizes the data which does still have to go out to disk. The net result is that SQL can simply get more transactions completed in the same amount of time because on average it's not having to wait so much on the storage before being able to get on with its next transaction. V-locity can be downloaded and installed without any disruption to live SQL servers. No SQL code changes are required and no reboots. Just install and typically you'll start seeing positive results in just a few minutes. Before we take a more in-depth look at that, I'd like to briefly mention that the V-locity software was awarded the Microsoft SQL Server I/O Reliability Certification. This means that whilst providing faster storage access, V-locity didn't adversely affect the required and recommended behaviors that an I/O subsystem must provide for SQL as defined by Microsoft themselves. Now, most SQL DBAs are familiar with why split pages are bad for performance. If you've got room and your update or insert doesn't require a split, well, this is pretty fast because SQL is just updating one page and then writing it out to disk and, of course, to the transaction log. But if the updated or inserted row doesn't fit, SQL needs to allocate a new page, move about half of the rows to the new page, and then write both pages to disk and to the transaction log. In addition, the pages in all the indexes that point to the data pages, well, they need to be updated too. So let's say that your table had one clustered index and 4 non-clustered indexes. That would mean at least 7 pages would need to be updated. You'd have 1 for the clustered index structure, 4 for the non-clustered indexes, and 2 in the data pages in the clustered index. So this page split would result in a minimum of 7 times the I/O as an insert or update that didn't require a page split. Now, this is an important point. Each I/O that takes place takes a measurable amount of time and resource to process. And the same is true when the Windows file system splits data as it writes out to the logical NTFS volume, and that can have significant performance ramifications too. And this is basically why DBAs format volumes to be used by SQL with a 64 kilobyte cluster size rather than leaving the NTFS default of just 4 kilobytes. It helps to avoid split I/O situations when writing to disk, and it keeps performance-losing file fragmentation from building up so quickly. But it doesn't fix the problem though. As your NTFS file systems continue to mature over time and files are created, extended and deleted, the free space on the NTFS volume will become more and more fragmented into smaller and smaller free space extents, increasing those split I/O situations when writing. And each time your write is split in this way, the data is being sent out to disk in separate I/O packets and at a much slower data transfer rate. And like split pages in SQL, each storage I/O takes a measurable amount of time and resource to process. So in the real world, a gigabyte of storage I/O traffic that should be written in 2,000 or 3,000 I/Os could now be taking 30,000 or 40,000 I/Os to complete. We call the performance penalty that these split I/O situations cause the Windows I/O tax, as in a tax on your performance due to split I/Os. In a virtualized environment, this performance penalty can be amplified by something called the I/O blender effect. And what's happening here is that you have small fractured I/O packets coming from the virtual machines, and as they pass through the hypervisor mixes these I/O streams together, causing a randomization effect. So what comes out between the physical host hypervisor and the disk storage controller is now a chaotic mess of small, fractured, and now very randomized I/O streams that by the time they hit the storage controller, really they couldn't be less storage friendly. It means that the storage controller is only receiving data in very small packets at a time, so it now only has the opportunity to create very small stripes across its media, and that means many more storage level operations than if the data hadn't been split as it was being written all the way up at that NTFS layer. Now, V-locity helps Windows avoid or prevent most of the excess, unnecessary, performance-losing split I/O traffic and replaces it with far fewer storage I/O packets, each one carrying a larger payload of data. And this makes the movement of data between server and storage more efficient, and it provides faster data transfer rates and greater data throughput, much like avoiding page splits wherever possible, and it allows the disk storage to store the data using far fewer storage level operations. V-locity will also help create those nice large free space extents quietly and automatically in the background using only otherwise idle compute resources to make it easier for the Windows write driver to write into. So think for a moment of a busy freeway or motorway at rush hour. Imagine that you've got lots of cars all sitting bumper to bumper with one person in each car and none of them are getting anywhere very quickly. Now, imagine that each car on the motorway is a storage I/O packet and each person in each car is your data. What V-locity is in effect doing is taking all of the people out of the cars and putting them into buses or coaches and removing all of the cars from the motorway and getting rid of all of that congestion so that now all the people or your data can now flow to their destination in a much more efficient manner. I hope that makes sense as an analogy. But that really is only half of the story. V-locity also introduces a RAM caching technique into the Windows operating system that further reduces the read I/O traffic that the back-end storage has to deal with. The performance benefits provided are in addition to SQL's own buffering and any caching natively provided by the Windows operating system. And this is basically how we could get 30% more SQL transactions done in the same amount of time during that testing that I mentioned before. Quite simply, SQL could get more work done in the same amount of time because it wasn't having to wait so much on the disk storage layer before being able to get on with its next transaction, and frankly because RAM is so much faster than disk storage. Oh, and it absolutely works with both physical and virtualized SQL servers, and in the cloud too. Storage I/O reduction, optimization, and RAM caching represent a significant reduction in workload that has to be processed by the backend storage. This is not only true of SQL Server storage traffic, but other workload types too. So in this example on the screen, let's say that the first VM is hosting SQL, and the second is hosting the application that interfaces with SQL, and the other two VMs are hosting busy file servers, and they're all sharing that same backend storage. You might have a situation where the traffic from the file servers are taxing the performance of SQL simply by keeping the storage layer busy. So SQL isn't necessarily the cause of the disk storage being slow, but it would likely be affected by the increased disk I/O queue depths and latency caused by the busy workloads on the file servers. So my recommendation would be to install the V-locity software on all Windows machines sharing that same backend storage. That way, from the point of view of the storage, it's now doing the least amount of work, regardless of which VM is generating the most workload at any given time. Now, at this point, some of you will be thinking, yes, but SQL is already using most of the available memory in the machine. How can you possibly create a RAM cache? And it's true that if SQL is left uncapped, there typically wouldn't be enough RAM for Condusiv software to create a cache with. We've intentionally designed our software so that it can't compete for system resources with anything else that's running, so that we can never be the cause of a memory starvation situation. It would only ever use some of the free RAM that isn't being used by anything else, and it'll dynamically size its cache, handing RAM back to Windows if other processes or applications need it. So for best results, you can easily cap the amount of RAM that SQL takes for its own form of caching or buffering. On busy database servers, if you can leave 16 gigabytes of RAM free, you'd have enough of a V-locity cache size to really make that machine's performance fly in most cases. And if you can't spare 16 gigabytes, leave 8 gigabytes. And if you can't afford 8 gigabytes, leave 4 gigabytes free. Even that is enough to make a difference. Smaller than that though, and the cache size would really be a bit too small, and any performance improvements would start to become limited. You might also be thinking that, well, actually SQL's buffering is good enough, so how does V-locity's caching complement this? At a basic level, SQL's cache does a pretty good job, and whilst that does have a positive impact on performance, V-locity's RAM caching is designed to eliminate the type of storage I/O traffic that tends to slow the storage down the most. And whilst that tends to be the smaller, more random read I/O traffic, it's not actually always the case. So V-locity uses a very lightweight storage filter driver to gather telemetry for machine learning. This allows the software to learn useful things like, what is the main application in use on a machine? What type of files are being accessed, and what type of storage I/O streams are being generated, and at what times of the day, the week, the month, the quarter. So it can be very intelligent about what the hot blocks of data are that need to be in the RAM cache, and more importantly, when. It can also use that telemetry to figure out how best to size the storage I/O packets to give the main application the best performance. If the way you use that machine changes over time, V-locity can automatically adapt to those changes without you having to reconfigure or tweak any settings. Validating results is really easy. First of all, you could measure the amount of SQL transactions being done each day with something like perfmon to see if they increase. Some customers see reports that they generate take less time to produce, or SQL batch imports take less time. Other batch jobs complete more quickly. Some customers have even done a simple stopwatch test to measure things like record retrieval times. However, Velocity itself comes with very transparent reporting that will show you exactly how much storage I/O traffic it's able to eliminate from the disk storage layer. You can see what percentage of the reads and writes are being eliminated, and it will show you how much storage time is being saved by the storage not having to process that eliminated I/O. If you're using thin provisioned storage, Velocity can help you reclaim space. If you're using thin provisioned VMDK files, for example, it can automatically zero out the free space so that you don't have to wait for hours for something like an sdelete pass to complete. And if you're thin provisioning down at the storage layer, it can also send SCSI unmap commands to the storage controller to say, hey, these blocks, they're no longer needed. You can add them back to the available pool. And if your VMs are provisioned with dynamically allocated RAM instead of a fixed amount of RAM, in such a way that the hypervisor can borrow some back to reallocate to some other virtual machine, it's important to make sure that you reserve enough RAM in your SQL VM's configuration for both SQL and Velocity. Otherwise, too much RAM in the VM could become driver locked by the hypervisor's ballooning driver, and that would mean Velocity might not get enough RAM to cache with effectively. Now, these are just some of the case studies that you can access on our website at condusiv.com. As an example, Bell Mobility on the bottom left, a telecoms company in Canada, saw the Velocity software reduce the storage I/O traffic to their SAN by 61%, which is huge. This gave them SQL report queries that were 3 times faster, with no additional hardware required. All they had to do was install the Velocity software, which, as I mentioned earlier, is completely non-disruptive. There are no SQL code changes required to make it work, no reboots required, and zero disruption to live running workloads, and just as importantly, the users. So, firstly, I would encourage you to share what you've learned in this session with colleagues. See what they have to say about this. The simplest and best way to test Velocity is to really try it for yourself with your real-world workloads. Everyone who's attending today will receive a full copy of the software from Condusiv directly, worth about £400 or 450 in euros. Make sure that you follow the best practice tips to get the best results, and ensure that you have at least 4 gig of RAM free or available to cache with. You can also try the software on all of your machines at once with the 30-day trialware version that you can download right now from condusiv.com/try. And by the way, you're very welcome to share the dashboard report data with a Condusiv engineer like myself for additional analysis and get a written engineer's report. The emails shown on the screen will get you directly connected with the lead engineer for your region. Even if you've just got questions after the presentation, please feel free to reach out. So, if your organization would benefit from faster storage at a reasonable price using the storage hardware that you already own, I would urge you just give it a try. You're not going to disrupt any live running workloads. You don't have to make any SQL code changes, and the whole download and installation will take no more than just a few minutes. Use the software to not only identify those servers that cause storage I/O performance issues, but fix those issues at the same time, and, of course, get faster SQL servers. So I hope that's been interesting. Let's see if we have had any questions come through.
So Mosen says, how much time needed for the initial start for detecting hot blocks? I would normally recommend installing the software and checking that dashboard report. Let's see if I can go back to that quickly. Here, and there's you can see on this screen capture, there's additional analysis here. So you've got the main dashboard, which is what we're seeing. We've got an IO performance dashboard, which shows things like storage latency, how much RAM is being used for caching and so on, and the analytics, which shows bar charts over an average 24 hours, showing things like IO reduction, IOs per second, what time of day you're satisfying most of the reads from RAM, and that sort of thing. Typically, you're going to start seeing results after just a few minutes, maybe 5-10 minutes, and it will already start caching data. I would suggest, though, it's worth leaving it maybe 24 hours before you first check the dashboard. That'll give that telemetry, that machine learning time to learn about the workloads and start figuring out what needs to be in the cache and when. If you're doing a full POC, what I normally do with prospective customers is we install it onto their machines and we let it run for a 2-week period, and then we pull all of the dashboard reports, and then I would analyze that and write a written engineer's report showing exactly what the benefit of the software has been over that time period. That's pretty good for a full proof of concept. And I know that not everybody, especially in larger organizations, wants to get hold of a trialware software and install it onto their live servers. So I have written a little batch job which will allow you to just install the software onto one test machine and run a lab test. So it'll generate a storage workload for an hour with all of V-locity's performance features turned off. And then it'll do the same again with V-locity's performance features turned on. And then when you compare the benchmark reports, you'll be able to see things like how much storage time was saved. I think the last time I ran this, it managed to save around about 30 or somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes of storage time in the hour where V-locity was active. And it'll also show you how much storage traffic the machine can cope with by itself, and how much more it can cope with when V-locity is there providing assistance. And the results are usually quite dramatic, quite positive. So I can also send a copy of that little test script out as well if you guys would like to have a play with that too. So yeah, it'll start working in just a few minutes, but if you're doing a proper test, I would check it after 24 hours and ideally let it run for a couple of weeks and then analyze the results. That'll give you a very good data set to work with. Now let's see what other questions we have. And Mohsen, I hope that answers that question for you, sir. So Aravind says, is there an equivalent for Azure database? Now, if you're talking about database as a service, no, because we need an operating system to install onto. But if you're running a Windows server which has SQL on it and you're hosting that in Azure or in AWS, then absolutely you can install this software and it is definitely of benefit, not only to the performance of the machine because it can make very good use of the RAM, but also in Azure and AWS, you are partially billed or charged on the amount of storage IO traffic that gets processed. In Azure, depending on what storage type you're consuming, you could be being charged, I think it's a fraction of a euro or a pound for every 10,000 storage transactions. Now, you can see on the screen here, we can significantly reduce the number of storage transactions. So if you're using Azure or AWS at scale, that could well be a storage billing saving that can become quite relevant. So I hope that answers that. Let's see. Mohammed says, my application is on Linux and I have a SQL database. Should I install on both SQL and the app server? Okay, so I'm afraid, Mohammed, we don't have this software today to install on Linux. It is a Windows only application. So I would recommend absolutely put it onto the Windows machine that's hosting the SQL Server, and that will allow it to provide better performance to the application server. So I hope that makes sense. Paul Gibson says, can we use perfmon counters to see latency improvements? Yes, absolutely. In fact, if you run that little test, do you know what? I will send that out to everybody. I'll make it available. If you run perfmon in the background whilst you're running that test, you'll see the difference in the perfmon counters. Things like latency, the throughput should increase, and that sort of thing. So absolutely, you can use perfmon. And also, when you run that test, Iometer itself, which is the tool that generates the storage workload, which isn't one of ours, by the way. It was originally created by Intel and has now been made available to freely download from the internet. That also records its own metrics and in simple CSV files. And it's not difficult really to put that into an Excel spreadsheet and graph it. And you can clearly see the difference in the second hour when V-locity is providing improvements and benefits. The average latency significantly decreases and the average throughput significantly increases. So absolutely, you can use perfmon and other ways of measuring this as well. So Eduardo says, real data on your email, my friend. Oh, so he sent me an email. Let's see if I can bring that up on my other machine here. So this is Eduardo, one of our customers, sending us real world data. Let's see if I can grab that. Whilst that's coming up, I'll answer the next question. Eduardo, thank you. I'll come back to that in just a moment. So Aravind says, seems it's for MS-SQL on-prem or MS-SQL on Cloud VM. Yes, absolutely right. Or even, yeah, so if you're running on-prem with SQL on a physical server or in a VM, absolutely fine. If you're running a cloud-based Windows VM with SQL, absolutely right. It will provide benefit there. Mosen says, yes, thanks. Okay, you're very welcome. Nuno says, this software is only for virtual servers and for physical servers. Oh, forgive me. Yes, I just answered that one. Yes, for both physical and virtual Windows servers. In fact, if you're running Windows Server 2008 R2 or later, then you're going to see the software will work just fine. And similarly, if you've got client operating systems, maybe you're considering a VDI environment, then it's fine on Windows 7 or later. So Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10. Right, let's have a quick look at Eduardo's email and I'll see if I can share that with everybody. Oh, wow. Yes, that's very good. Okay, so let me see if I can flip over to another screen here. Let's find a free one. Here we go. And see if we can bring up Outlook. I don't normally do this on the fly like this. This is quite exciting. I don't normally interrupt webinars like this. Okay, whilst that's coming up, let's answer the next question. So Simon says, what is the license model / prices? Okay, good question. And it's probably one that better fits one of our sales guys. As you can probably tell, I'm more of an engineer than a sales guy. The basic licensing model, in fact, well, there's several licensing models. If you wanted to buy it on a per machine basis, it's about £400 per machine. Most people who want it for a virtual environment tend to buy a host license. So you're licensing the physical host hypervisor, which is, from memory, don't hold me to this, it's I think it's about £3,500 to £4,000. Most people would go for that because it allows you to install the V-locity software onto all of the Windows VMs being hosted by that hypervisor and any future ones you want to create. So you can see it if you're hosting more than sort of 7 or 8 virtual machines on a host, that's probably the most sensible licensing option. In addition to that, we also offer bulk license discounts. So if you wanted to buy a larger quantity, we offer volume discounts on our pricing, which are quite attractive actually. So if you're wanting to get more in-depth pricing information and quotations, the best thing to do is speak to one of our guys, explain what type of environment you have, and we can help you find the most economic way to purchase the software for you. For example, if you're a government organization or an educational organization, we offer additional discounts for that as well. So it's always worth getting in touch and making sure you have the best deal and the best quotation that we can possibly provide you. So I hope that answers that. Selva says, how much RAM is required for a 64 gigabyte RAM system? Okay, so sorry, excuse me, just one moment. Oh, I do apologize. I had a tickle in my throat and I didn't want to cough down the microphone at everybody. So if you've got a 64 gig server that's running SQL, that's a pretty reasonable amount of RAM. I would suggest, if it was me running this, I would set it up so that SQL is capped so that it leaves at least 8 gigabytes of RAM free, which is pretty easy to do. It's quite straightforward. A quick Google search will show you how to do that if you need it, or email me and I can send you some instructions. It's very quick, very simple, and not disruptive. But yeah, on a 64 gig RAM system, if you leave 8 gig free, that would roughly give us a 4 or 5 gig cache size, which again, dynamically sized, so it's going to grow and shrink depending on the resource requirements of everything else. But that should be enough to really make that machine's performance fly and be pretty good. Ricardo says, thanks, a very good presentation. Ricardo, you're being far too kind given the fact that I messed up the beginning, but I appreciate that. As I say, I will re-record this and get the recording out to everybody. Marco says, is there a reseller program? Yes, there is. In fact, we always try to adopt a channel partner first mentality. We would much rather sell through our channel partners wherever possible, because in reality, we're not a massive organization in the EMEA region, certainly not as big as we would like to be. So by providing as much power as we can to our resellers and other channel partners, it allows us a wider reach. So absolutely, there's a reseller program. If you want to sign up for it, you can do that on our website at condusiv.com and sign up as a reseller, and then that also gives you the opportunity to register deals so that they become yours and protected. So I hope that helps. Now let's see if I can get that email up here. Here we go, from Eduardo. So this is some real data from a real customer that he emailed as we were talking. Let's take a look at this. I'll just make it a bit bigger. So on his environment, so he's been running V-locity 7 since May 2017. And look at this. He's saved over 24 entire days worth of storage time. And more importantly, 73% of all of the reads that are being generated by his workloads aren't having to go out and bother the storage at the back end, and 43% of all of the writes. That's really quite phenomenal. That's a significant reduction in workload that the back-end storage has to deal with, and that frees up time and resource to process additional workloads. So that might mean that storage bound applications are now able to get more work done in the same amount of time. Or it may mean that because you've got all this additional storage IO headroom being handed back to the environment, well, now you can host more VMs, more users generating storage IO traffic than you otherwise would be able to cope with on that same storage. So hugely beneficial. And Eduardo, thank you so much for sending that through. That's a perfect demonstration from a real world customer. I couldn't have asked for more, and I certainly didn't ask him to do that. So that's brilliant. Eduardo says that's a SharePoint server farm with SQL. Well, there you go. Fantastic. That's really good. Eduardo, thank you for that. That's really appreciated. Okay, so I think that's all of the questions we've had. Again, my sincere apologies for omitting to share the screen at the beginning. As I say, I will re-record that and send it out, and I'll splice on the this Q&A session that we've had at the end. Please try the software. Honestly, it takes a minute or two to download and install it. You're not going to disrupt any workloads. And for those of you that want to run a quick lab test first on a single test server, I'll get a copy of that script, that little batch job that I wrote, out to you all. Yeah, give it a try and let us know what you think. If it looks interesting, we'll be more than happy to assist you further with quotations, discounts, making sure that you have the best price that we can possibly offer you. Paul says, thanks, Spencer. Good job. No worries about the slides not showing at the start. Paul, you're very kind. Thank you. And thank you all for your understanding and patience. I really hope this has been useful. And yeah, thank you all so much for your time today. And please do get in touch. Even if you have any questions, let us know and we'll do our very best to help. Thank you, everyone. Have a very good rest of day.